Hello and welcome to this little episode, which is a totally discrete episode. I don't know why I'm calling it an episode, but you join me in my little study, and I have got a rather stark haircut, and it's quite alarming. So if you can ignore that and just listen to the content, that'd be useful. But I wrote about last Sunday. I spent a couple of hours writing a poem called "The Roadmen of Shefford." Which is a bit of a satire or parody, or it's just having fun with the idea of roadmen, of which I think we're all familiar with what roadmen are. They're these young people that tend to hang around. As I say in the footnote here, roadman, a young man who is associated with street culture and is characterised as tough and combative, especially one who is a gang member. And as I say, rather hilariously, not in this context, someone who fixes roads, which might set the tone of somehow we might talk about certain other topics I'm going to talk about. But what I realised, that's my cat, Veronica, what I realised is that this poem could actually be used, excuse me, quite usefully as a pedagogical tool, or a tool to teach children, adults, teachers, about poetry, about the intricacies of poetic form and metre and things like that, but also about some sociological issues or cultural issues that could engender conversations. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to read the poem, excuse me, and then I'm going to discuss some of these ideas. So the poem is up here behind me, there, and I'm going to read it, and then what I'm going to do is put up list of discussion points about how we might talk about it. So firstly, I'll read the poem. The Roadmen of Shefford. The Roadmen of Shefford, we've all seen them swarm. They saunter in dim hordes, shopkeepers be warned. They emerge after school, at just after 3, slouch home to bejewel in trackies and tees. Slow hung are their trousers with no need for belt. School togs are just downers for the riz to be dealt. Their rosy cheeks covered by balaclava, sometimes with small goggles or such palaver. Now all set for mayhem, they call mates to play, and set out like golems, brave knights of doomsday. Watch out, you old granddads, keep clear, you weak nerds. The roadmen and the nomads will make themselves heard. They swagger to co-op, they loiter outside, they smoke weed to show off, all puffed up with pride. They roam without reason, they speak in bad rhyme. It's straight out of Compton, but in Shefford, with grime. These cherubim children, when all dressed in tat, think they've become bad men to express their bare brap. They're a band of brothers looking out for their blood. They're linked up like lovers, gassed ruling Shefford. A grind finding penting, so let's stick to our mates, 'cause girls are real frightening, pretend that we hates. Mandem makes it feel good to be less alone, to be misunderstood by the feds and the drones. Oh, give me an e-bike to zoom at high speed, a glorified child's trike to deliver me weed. More pocket bands, please, mum, that I may progress from waste man to bad man, show the ends my success. For under my armour I'm giving no bait, no dench, there's no drama, no chirps, there's no mates. I Amazoned mad skeng to make me more peak, bad though did it end as the driver was meek. He asked for the adult to deliver my swag, but Granny was out, so returned was the bag. Alas, it's just me now, my bros and my fleek, as under my face mask my eyebrows are sleek. Wagwan to 6 Shefford, we seek some geldam, them, but they'd rather be reading than be seen with roadman. So saunter we loiter in all black Nike, dominoes reconnoitre, I forgot to eat tea. It's time now to home rock, to rest up and troll, to check on the TikTok. Road manning takes tolls. Tomorrow at school time, Gran says I must go. Post 3 though, I'll still rule. As roadman I've flow. Farewell, Shefford posses, farewell to their noise, but whisper it softly, they're just little boys. So that's the poem. Now you'll notice that I have, as I say, lots of footnotes here, primarily translating a lot of the words. Some of you may know some of these words. I certainly knew probably about 2 of them before I did some research on roadman slang. Such a thing existed. Also using the Urban Dictionary, which is brilliant, has always been brilliant. So, for example, some of the words, brap is an imitative sound, slang term that can mean the sound of a burst of gunfire. Also used to describe a state of aggressive flowing energy. Pang is a very beautiful or attractive. Ting is a thing, but attractive thing, usually a female. Waste man is a worthless, inadequate, or useless man. Peak is badness. Fleek is flawlessly styled or groomed. So we've got all of these terms that are there, and they're up here. So how might we discuss this poem, you might ask? Well, I think we could talk about the poem from a range of angles. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to get up another sheet of Word, a Word document that I've also got here. And we could discuss it from a range of perspectives. Let's get this to the side. Zoom out a bit so we can see most of it. Okay, so the ways in which we might discuss it are from a range of different perspectives. But for example, you could start, I'm just going to trip through some of these things. You could start thinking about grammar, and in particular, not how grammar works together, but in particular how new words, full lexical words, or open class words are nouns, adjectives that you can add to the stock of English words. So as we know, every year the common stock, commonly used, and you could say commonly sanctioned words enter into the Oxford Dictionary. These are lexical, fully lexical. They're by which we mean they can be added. They are full words. They're not prepositions or copulatives and stuff like that. Anyway, so we could talk about the entrance of new words, and we talk about slang, patois, argot, etc., and the relationship between slang, street slang, and slang in other domains, and how these enter into the language. So that's the kind of useful starting point, you could say. Secondly, we could then get into the intricacies of poetry. So the first thing we could talk about is metre. So in terms of metre, we have, most of us might know, some of us might not know, that we have different types of foot, which are comprised of syllables. So the most common is the I am and the trochee. So the I am is D dum, unstressed, stress. The trochee is dum D, so stress, unstressed. There is an anapaist, so these then get into triple meters, so triple feet. But most commonly we have iambs and trochees. So for example, in Shakespeare we have iambic, 2 feet, a pentameter, 5 feet, 5 feet of 2 beats, da 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 da, etc. So that's common in iambic pentameter. So what this poem is written in, if we look at these lines, the Roadmen of Shefford, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So I have alternating six beats, or 3 feet, and 6 beats. 6 beats with 3 feet, and then we've all seen them swarm. So I have probably 2.5 feet, or you could have 1 foot, one iamb and another dactyl. In other words, I've got six syllables and 5 syllables alternate. It's a bit of a weird metre that I've created. Nevertheless, it relates to what's called common metre. So common metre, as we see on here, is 4 lines alternating between iambic tetrameter, so in other words 4 feet per line, and iambic trimeter, 3 feet per line. And usually common metre has an AB rhyme scheme, and I generally keep an AB rhyme scheme all the way throughout, although we'll talk about this in a minute. There are quite bad rhymes, deliberately and somewhat not deliberately. An example of common metre is something we probably all know, which is amazing grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. I once was lost, but now am found, was blind, but now I see. So here we have iambic tetrameter, followed by iambic trimeter, and then the same again. I say here, note the lack of pronoun to fit the metre. So I once was lost, but now am found. Now they could have put a contraction, I'm found, which would have been one beat. But you'd probably say in normal language, I once was lost, but now I am found. I am found. But that would add too many beats. So that's another thing you can say about when you create poetic lines, you can press to stick with metre. Traditional poetic lines, that is. And ballad metre is a form of common metre, but it's slightly different in that it's got the same 3/4 quatrains, 4/3 lines, triameter, tetrameter, but it also has and it has quatrains of 4 lines, but it's not necessarily using iambics, not necessarily using the these unstressed stress. Excuse me. The other difference in ballad form is that it has ABCB rhyme schemes, so you don't necessarily have to rhyme the first line with the third. So I deviate from that in that I usually try and have a third rhyme, so it's A, B, A, B. An example of ballad metre, a famous example, brilliant example, is from the poet Emily Dickinson. Because I could not stoop for death, he kindly stooped for me. The carriage held but just ourselves and immortality. That's one of the best uses of using all of these syllables. So it's 2 words, but all of these syllables complete the trimeter, which is really interesting. I've always talked about the other thing about metre and grammar within poetic grammar, you could call it, is that when you need to invert the phrase. And what invert the phrase means in shifting grammar to make a rhyme. So sometimes in a poem you'll need to keep a word to stick at the end in order to rhyme. So in which case what you end up doing is changing subject, verb, object relations, proper relations in grammar as it were, to fit the line. And that sometimes happens throughout this poem. And also contractions. Let's have a look at some contractions in my poem. Let's find one. So a grind finding peng ting. So let's stick to our mates. So let's stick to our mates. So here, let us, it could be let us. In fact, as I read this out, I realise this is 2 6 beat lines, but that's, there's variation there. I could say that I did that for a reason, but I haven't in this case. My point is that it could be let us, so let us stick to mates, in which case it would add another syllable and it would make the line longer. So contractions are often used to keep within metrical format. Isn't that interesting? Right, so to follow that up, let's look at another thing you could talk about is rhymes and sound patterns in the poem. Which I have a lot of fun with. You can see here in the first stanza, I write, the roadmen of Shefford, we've all seen them swarm. They saunter in dim hordes, shopkeepers be warned. So I do try and maintain this common A-B rhyme structure throughout the poem. But there are some of them are quite bad rhymes. As I say here, this poem contains half rhymes, so rhymes that sort of half sound like they might do, I rhymes, and bad rhymes. Full rhymes is like car, bar. That's a full rhyme, full end rhyme, because you have this R sound. Half rhymes are sort of like bar, burr, similar because of the R, but not quite. Different vowels. But I rhymes are words that look the same on the page, and bad rhymes are just bad rhymes, and I've got a lot of those. There is also a play with the pronunciation of the word Shefford and how you pronounce things to create a rhyme. So here we have the roadmen of Shefford. We've all seen them swarm. They saunter in dim hordes. Shopkeepers be warned. But one of the things I wanted to do is the roadmen of Shefford, and the reason I wanted to do that is because I'm trying to play with the distinction between so-called dialect language, and received pronunciation, which is what I generally speak on my good days. And so the roadmen of Shefford, we've all seen them swarm. They saunter in dim hordes. So the idea is that, and we'll come back to this in a minute, is the persona of the poet, which is not necessarily me in the voice of the poet, is hamming up the distinction between, oh, I'm going to pronounce it Shefford, we've all seen the swarm, because it creates a sense of arrogance and the fact that this person is looking down on roadmen, supposedly, the voice. So it plays on this distinction between the types of language. But here we have the Roadmen of Shefford, we've all seen the swarm. They saunter in dim hordes, shopkeepers be warned. So swarm and warmed, almost full rhyme, is not quite. They do look the same though. So that's one of the things that I wanted to draw attention to, really, is sound. But there are lots of other sound patterns that you could talk about within this poem and others. And you could use this to talk about. Alliteration is, of course, word initial letters and sounds. So let's have a... do I have any versions of these? Cherubim children, these cherubim children. So these two sounds, cherubim children. The idea of having alliterative sound patterns is that the words sort of enhance each other. So cherubim children almost enhances the cherubimness of the childness and the childness of the cherubimness, as it were. It sort of reinforces the fact that they're young and innocent. The language, it's called a phonesthetic fallacy when you attribute sound as if it's got full meaning. So you might be overreading that, but at the very least, this sort of what's called an internal phonetic patterning is drawing attention to the phrase at the very least. Or here we have these cherubim children, when all dressed in tat, they think they've become bad men to express their bare brap. So bare brap, that's the very deliberate alliterative cluster there, which is using two slang words together, and it somehow reinforces the feeling and of the violence of the language, and also what it's describing, because brap is an onomatopoeic word in the sense that it relates to the way in which the sound of gunfire, as we said, an imitative slang term that can mean the sound of burst of gunfire, the sound of flatulence, or the sound of a motorcycle engine, brap, 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 and you often hear that in raps and stuff. Also describes state of aggressive flowing energy. So anyway, the point is that the alliteration become bad men as well. You know, we have this b sounds, which is sort of imitating the thing that it's describing. So you could talk about that. Assonance, you could also talk about repetition of vowel sounds. So we have 5 letters, 5 letters that create vowels, but we've got 12 sounds, vowel sounds. So sometimes in poetry you can think about the way in which sound patterns work like that. You might also talk about consonants, repetition of consonants. I'm not going to go into those here, but you could discuss that there are lots of versions of this. As I say here, the last 3 examples, alliteration, assonance, consonants, are actually examples of phonetic parallelism. Now, this is where we sort of start to broaden out the scope of the poem to think about more things that can be related to everyday life. So one of the things you might think about is, and I've alluded to this, is voice in the poem. So what we have in the poem is primarily 2 voices. So we've got a kind of first-person voice, which we often associate with the poet, though it's very, very important to realise that it might not be the actual poet, i.e. the person that wrote it. It could be what's called a persona, and I said that the persona of this poem might be considered to be a kind of arch, dismissive, satirical person that is sending up the roadman. Excuse me. Excuse me. And so we've got 2 primary voices. In the first 10 stanzas, we have this voice, whoever that is, the persona, the voice of the poem, first person, we are doing this, etc. And then the last stanzas is the voice of the roadman. So in stanza excuse me, in stanza, whatever stanza this is, a grind finding peng ting. This then starts to have the roadman's voice, and then it's the roadman's voice for the rest of the time, for a lot of the time anyway, until the last stanza, where returns back to the persona of the poet, farewell, Shefford posses farewell their noise. So we oscillate between those two voices, but it's fairly fixed, and that's another way in which you can also think about stanzaic development. How the structure of the poem is like it's structured to set up the first voice, and then the second voice comes along. So there are also examples in the poem of what might be called free indirect speech, which is the roadman speaking, but not in inverted commas. So here, so for example, school togs are just downers for the riz to be dealt. Now, it's using the slang word riz to mean charisma here, and it could be the roadman speaking, or it could be the voice of the poet offering a kind of free indirect version of the speech, so it's not direct speech. So it could be the roadman, it could be the voice. There are also a poet's satirical, or the writer's satirical insertions, which come in the stanzas 19 to 20. So 19 to 20. 19 begins, Wagwan to sick shepherd, we seek some gildam, but they'd rather be reading than be seen with roadman. Now, this is in quotation marks. So it could be the self-reflection of the roadman saying, I know they'd rather be reading, and that goes to another topic that I'm going to speak about. Or it could be the voice of the poet, or it could be both fused together. And that's the interesting thing about voice, is that you're not necessarily clear as to who is speaking, and whether there's irony added to it by this free indirect or satirical insertions. The other example of I say satirical and it's not really that funny, but it might be, is the next stanza 20. So saunter we loiter in all black Nike. That's making a joke about Nike and the pronunciation of Nike, and how you might take on an Americanism in order to describe it, but it also creates the syllable count and the line ending rhyme. Instead of Nike, we needed the E. Domino's reconnoiter, I forgot to eat tea. Now, I forgot to eat tea is a sort of diminutive expression to sort of ham up the childishness, perhaps, of the roadmen that are speaking, roadman that is speaking. But Domino's reconnoiter. Now, this is all in supposedly the voice of the roadman. Now, I'm not suggesting that roadmen don't know the word reconnoiter to sort of check out, but I deliberately put that word in to confuse the register, and we'll talk about register in a minute, to set up a sense that there might be a distinction between the actual roadman's voice, the poet's voice, and that the poet, whoever that is, might be satirizing the fact that they don't know this word, possibly. But, it's just, it's there for effect, and the effect can be interpreted in any way you like. The other thing you notice here is this contraction, dominoes, and I had to put dominoes because the I, dominos, would add too many syllables. Although, as I'm discovering as I read this poem, it's kind of, sometimes I don't get my syllable count as close to perfect as I can. Anyway, so those are other things. Another thing about voice, and that's about my voice, which, forgive me, I've been clearing my throat a lot, is it's a challenge to read the poem aloud, as the readers need to decide whether a reader of the poem needs to decide whether they mimic an approximation of what they consider to be a roadman voice, in other words, imitation, or whether they're going to retain the consistency of enunciation and pronunciation established in the opening stanzas. Now, I read it in my voice. Of course, when you're using slang words, you necessarily, like wagwan, you can't not accentalize it, if you can put it that way, because it's very much based in Jamaican, British Jamaican dialect. And the same with geldam. There's no way of pronouncing that with received pronunciation, as it were. And that's what's interesting about the word. So you have to make that decision. Now, what I didn't do is put on some sort of terrible impression of some roadman that I've got in my head, because I thought that would be embarrassing and also counterproductive. But nevertheless, the poem does pose those problems to a reader, and they're quite interesting problems. Another interesting thing you can talk about this poem is how we render or write or transcribe graphologically through text words. So brap, for example, is a really interesting example. That is an approximation, a lexical approximation. So it's become a word, brap. But it could be brap, and you could put loads and loads of R's. But then that's more of an onomatopoeic suggestion, and there's a problem with onomatopoeia in terms of how do you graphically represent it. So you could talk about the way in which, how do you render slang? If you're using regularized ideas about language, then it poses questions as to whether it actually represents what it's trying to say. And then, of course, to someone that's unfamiliar with the word, how are they going to pronounce it, blah, blah, blah. So that's a really interesting thing you could talk about. The challenge of reading it also has some cultural sensitivity, which I'll talk about below. And I've talked about the word reconnoitre. The other thing we can talk about, and this relates to these ideas, is the modes of register. So what the poem deliberately does is exploit several variations between register, i.e. formal, informal, tone, mode, and these issues, these modes of register, open up really interesting broader considerations. So stuff to do with dialect. So dialect suggests regions. Is there a dialect between men and women? Now, roadmen dialect seems to be used a lot by roadmen, but of course by men, boys. But there is transference now. But also a lot of the roadman language, as far as I can work out, well, not a lot of it. Some of it is quite misogynistic, deliberately so, or just because it has that baggage. And so there's an interesting distinction here between dialect, like is there a specific male dialect? Is there a specific female dialect? Not necessarily domain, but just like the types of words. We'll come to domain in a minute. The poem also registers this difference between, and I've talked about this a minute before, medium. So the differences between reading and speaking are very, very different when you perform them. So how has this poem rendered speech? Or is it simply all writing? You could talk about that. Differences tenor. So there's formality and informality. Now, the formality is sort of thrust on the language by the nature of the fact that it's a poem. But of course, poems don't necessarily have to be formal, but there's a formal form, which then creates a kind of sense of formality. But then there's a lot of informality in it as well, both in the roadman's voice and throughout the poem here. Their rosy cheeks covered by balaclava, sometimes with goggles, or such palaver. Now, you wouldn't consider such palaver, that construction, to be particularly formal, but it's in a formal register of poem. So it's a really interesting mix of registers here. And lastly, we've got domain. And what domain means stylistically in linguistics is words associated with particular specialist groups. So, for example, you can talk about medical words, the domain of medical words, and others. So, so you could say, is it a domain of gang culture or youth culture? Do they have a particular language? Rather like, for example, you might have Polari as part of gay culture. Etc. The words associated with that. So you could talk about the poem in that relation. But again, as I said, these things lead to broader issues. So, for example, you could talk about discourse and power, and I've alluded to this a little bit. So you could ask of the poem, like, who has the power in the poem? Now, you could say the voice of the poet, the persona, the person who's writing it, has the power, and that perhaps brings about the satire. You could interpret it as it being very, very dismissive, arch, and derisory about the roadmen that are described. You could do, and that would be easy to do. That's a very straightforward thing. And therefore, is it stripping the roadman, the voice of the roadman, of their power? And what does that mean? You could ask. And so that leads to the next question. Is the poem demeaning or simply rendering, for example, dialect words? It's an open question. You could ask yourself the question, and people can come to their own conclusions about it. Not just about me reading it and my perspective, because I'm being quite neutral about my perspective on this. I don't really have a perspective, I just find it fun. But you could think, is it demeaning? But you could have, that's a discussion point. So another broad discussion point which relates to this actually is the notion of cultural appropriation. And it relates to voice, it relates to all of those things. We might discuss, as I say here, the potential issues of using slang like this, particularly ones that are developed in, for example, Black British cultures in this manner, or other cultures, whether they're major or minor, minority cultures, etc., etc. Is it what are the lines between the use of another kind? So cultural appropriation is quite interesting. So if we do consider this question, we might need to decide, for example, if we do say this is cultural appropriation, we have to decide that, let's just talk about class, that the person that writes the poem is a middle class, upper class, and that they're culturally appropriating what might be considered to be a lower class dialect, or dialect that is of the lower class, etc. So you could say that's an appropriation. You could say it's a white dude appropriating Black British culture. You could also look at that, and then that could also inaugurate things. You could also say that, my references to NWA and Straight Outta Compton, you could sort of say, well, that's not your culture, etc. I mean, but that's American culture, Straight Outta Compton, NWA. But again, those things. And with the allusion to NWA here, this leads to the next point here, which is about, is there a general British culture? So is there a general British culture that we all share and an attendant common permissible word stock? Or are, as we all know, certain words off limits? I'm just going to let my cat into the room. Or are certain words off limits? Now, I'm not entirely sure whether people might consider to be certain words off limits within here. The words that I think would be perhaps most problematic in those ways, or at least initiate a discussion, would perhaps be mandem, what else? Mandem, wagwan, and Gyeldam. I don't even know if I'm pronouncing that correctly. I think I am. Because wagwan in particular is from Jamaican English. Gyeldam, as far as I can work out, is from West Indian English. So people might sort of say, there are certain people, myself included, who are not allowed to use those words. They might say that. So, and if they do, that's an interesting discussion about why. You could ask why, about cultural appropriation. So are certain words off limits? The last couple of things, identity and gender. So the poem really invites us to consider identities, gang, group, social class, sense of camaraderie enabled by slang use, but also gender. And in relation to gender, I think there is a running theme which I have put in the poem deliberately, and in relation to what I've just said about cultural appropriation as a bloke, I think perhaps I can talk about as well, is the notion of masculinity, sort of the fragility of masculinity perhaps, but particularly in adolescence, young boys, teens, in between us. So we might discuss the notion in this thing, the notion of toxicity, fragility, as well as male violence. It's a joke in here about the young man or adolescent trying to get a skeng, which is a weapon, and that's not funny at all. But the joke is that they can't get it because their gran wasn't there to let it in. It's a joke. It's a very dark joke. But the point is that it could inaugurate a discussion about the necessity of possessing these weapons in order to feel masculine, or and the big man, a bad man rather than a waste man, etc., etc. So, and the other thing is youth culture, consumer and fashion, the consumption of roadmen. When I did some research on roadmen clothing, I didn't buy any, but there are roadmen clothing that you can get, and so we could all dress up if we liked. And that sort of leads to the last point, right, about performance and about thinking about, we all go through phases, we all perform. And in a sense, what I'm doing here is performing the role of a poet, performing the role of a roadman, performing the role of satire about roadmen. And there's a whole, in all of these things, go back and forth. So the last thing I'll do is just read the poem again for you all, after all of that. The roadmen of Shefford, we've all seen them swarm. They saunter in dim hordes, shopkeepers be warned. They emerge after school at just after 3, slouch home to bejewel in trackies and tees. Slow hung are their trousers with no need for belt. School togs are just diners for the riz to be dealt. their rosy cheeks covered by balaclava, sometimes with small goggles or such palaver. Now all set for mayhem, they call mates to play, and set out like golems, brave knights of doomsday. Watch out, you old granddads, keep clear, you weak nerds. The roadmen and the nomads will make themselves heard. They swagger to co-op. They loiter outside, they smoke weed to show off, and all puffed up with pride. They roam without reason, they speak in bad rhyme. It's straight out of Compton, but in Shefford with grime. These cherubim children are all, when all dressed in tat, think they've become bad men to express their bearer brap. They're a band of brothers looking out for their blood. They're linked up like lovers, gassed, ruling Shefford. A grind finding painting, so let's stick to our mates, 'cause girls are real frightening, pretend that we hates. Mandem makes it feel good to be less alone, to be misunderstood by the feds and the drones. Oh, give me an e-bike to zoom at high speed, the glorified child's trike to deliver me weed. More pocket bands, please, mum, that I may progress from waster man to bad man, show the ends my success. For under my armour I'm giving no bait, no dent, there's no drama, no chirps, there's no mates. I Amazoned mad skeng to make me more peak, bad though did it end, as the driver was meek. He asked for the adult to deliver my swag, but Granny was out, so returned was the bag. Alas, it's just me now, my bros and my fleek, as under my face mask my eyebrows are sleek. Wagwan to Chick Shefford, we seek some geldam, delm, but they'd rather be reading than be seen with roadman. So saunter we loiter in all black Nike, dominoes reconnoitre, I forgot to eat tea. It's time now to home rock, to rest up and troll, to check on the TikToks, road manning takes tolls. Tomorrow it's school time, Gran says I must go. Post 3 though, I'll still rule as roadman I flow. Farewell Shefford posses, farewell to their noise, but whisper it softly, they're just little boys. So that's the poem. Email me if you want to, or contact me if you want a copy of the poem and a copy of the notes. Otherwise, bye-bye.